Almost. Okay. Go ahead.
Welcome to the Center for Global Justice. My name is Betsy Bowman, and I'm one of the co-founders of the center, along with Bob Stone and Cliff Duran. We are initiating
Yes, go ahead.
our hybrid snowbird symposium. For 15 years, we had only in-person events. And during the pandemic, of course, we switched to Zoom events. And now that we hope the pandemic is over, we're having hybrid events. We discovered the wonders of having people from all over the world as speakers, and we were no longer limited to people who are in San Miguel, but we wanted to now continue with bringing in speakers from the outside and having in-person events for the people who are here, because so many of our friends are snowbirds or they come in the summer. And we have a nice community here, especially in the winter. And it's nice for everyone to get together in person. So welcome. As you know, the Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering the solidarity economy. Without our previous revenue generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars. So those of you out in Zoom land and cyberspace, you can donate at our webpage at www.globaljusticecenter.org. We will now be resuming our
Betsy, you are muted. We can't hear you. It's still muted. Hello, Betsy. I'm afraid we can't hear you. You're muted. Bob, Betsy is muted. Okay, she turned it on now.
Thursday, we always show a video at 11:30.
Okay.
And this Thursday, we'll be showing Cuba's life task. Combating Climate Change. The person who made the documentary, Helen Yaffe, will be here to discuss it. Next Monday is Bob Stone and Cliff Duran and their involvement in the 60s in the civil rights movement. I see some of our friends on the Zoom page coming in. Our speaker for today, we are honored to have Professor Marco Gómez. The title of his talk for today is Global Capitalism and the Global Struggle for Socialism. He is a professor at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, where he teaches the history and sociology of work, and where he does research on the global capitalist economy and state, and on the workers' struggles and the workers' economy. He's part of an international network that we're also part of, we at the Center for Global Justice, called the Economy of the Workers, or La Economía de los Trabajadores, which was founded in 2007 in Argentina in the wake of the economic crisis there in Argentina. And it promotes cooperatives, which are worker-owned, worker-run businesses, and recuperated factories. And it's a movement to build an alternative economy, or to, simply provide, keep businesses going that are threatened with bankruptcy, or form new businesses for people who are unemployed, or when people have great ideas of a business. So we're very involved in strengthening the solidarity economy here in the San Miguel area, and also internationally. And as you can tell from the title of Professor Gómez's talk, Global Capitalism, Global Struggle for Socialism, our network is global, international, because we have to respond to the international crisis of capitalism. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Marco, and he is already with a PowerPoint presentation. So Marco, please.
Okay, Betsy, thank you very much. I want to say hello to all of you that are tuned in on this talk, and that are also holding a meeting in San Miguel to participate in the discussion. As well, Betsy has already presented me, so I will go directly to the talk. The idea is to give a general, paint a general picture of what the workers' struggles imply in this new, more recently consolidated world capitalist system. My point of view is that it is no longer possible to merely consider the national or even regional struggles because of the created global capitalist structure, but that it is necessary for the workers' movement in the world to gain progress in their struggles against capitalism. It is absolutely necessary to organize globally and to wage these struggles gradually in a more global manner. So I will go directly, I will share my screen with you and go directly to my talk. I hope you can see it. Is it? Okay, fantastic, good. let me just wait a moment, because here we go. Okay. For centuries, I'm going to read, I know it's a bit not customary, but I'm going to read what is written in on the presentation for my own sake, so that I know what I'm talking about, and also because there's no way to put it in images. So for centuries, world capitalism has integrated basically through exchange relations, or what is called the world market, or also what Marx in his study of capitalism calls the social division of labor. And the state in previous times was mostly the sum of the national states and their colonies. After World War II, world capitalism continued to be integrated through exchange relations, but gradually began to develop the integration of global production structures, basically multinational corporations interconnected through global production chains, what Marx called the technical division of labor. And the class struggle thus began to acquire an international character. Symptoms of this globally integrated capitalism are the communications, transport, and water and energy distribution systems have acquired an increasingly global structure. Certain regions, mostly Asia, tend to become an intricate web of regional trade treaties. Also, with the rise of global state and private institutions, including trading blocs, international agreements, and global institutions such as the UN, NATO, Davos, Switzerland, Bilderberg, and others, the global state is no longer the mere sum of national states. At the same time, one national state, US imperialism, struggles to maintain a global hegemony through the dominion of the US dollar as world currency and through its own global military structure, together with its global network of military treaties and NATO. Corresponding to these developments, class struggle gradually has acquired a global character. In the 19th century, Marx considered that the workers' struggles was international in its content, but national in its form. Today, even the form of class struggle is becoming international. Some expressions of this tendency are the following. Migrating workers wage a global struggle for the free movement of workers all over the world. Perhaps they are not conscious of this, but in practice, they are trying to break down the borders around the world in order to be able to move freely from many parts of the world to other parts. Also, some popular uprising and mass movements tend to take place on a regional scale. For instance, the women's movement, the Arab Spring, the ongoing European Union's workers' struggles, the turn to the left in election results in Latin America, and of course, all these uprisings that are taking place in Latin America today. More recently, now, the Peruvian uprising of the workers against the de facto coup by the right in Peru. The conscious attempts to form worldwide trade union structures, global cooperative movements, peasant and agricultural workers' international associations, the movements of the peasants without land, sin tierra, and working class political organizations is currently taking place. Global capitalism can be understood through the growing global network of the infrastructure. Communications are global in nature. Transports are global in nature, considering the railroad, the roads, and the maritime and air routes around the world. Many raw materials flow globally, such as oil, gas, and water pipelines. Energy networks are global. Although they may be organized nationally, they are very closely interconnected in different regional and increasingly global networks. Production networks, which is what we will center our ideas on, are increasingly becoming global networks. And of course, the migrating workforce is increasingly a global phenomenon. We can see the global communication network. On the one hand, on the right side, you have how the communication connections are taking place around the world. This image that I'm showing here shows North America, basically the United States, as the center of connections. Of course, this is a very one-sided point of view. If one were to focus on China, we would have another view. If we focus in Europe, we would have another view of how connections are taking place. Although, of course, the United States is the center of perhaps the greatest networks. On the left side, we have the global sensor networks. Sensors are being developed not only within the factory, but through the digitalization of components. They are being organized also on a city level, country level, and world level. This is a small image giving an idea of how the world is being connected through a series of, of all kinds of sensors that measure temperatures, that are cameras and other types of sensors, and how many gadgets are being connected through these sensors, and so forth and so on. So this is a global sensor network which I'm describing here. One of the greatest and latest ideas is this intelligent planet, how through the computer network built around internet is interconnecting not only people, but also through the idea of the Internet of Things, connecting things, that is components installed in airplanes, in telephones, in whatever you want. These are being completely interconnected globally. IBM, I put this image from IBM because IBM has transformed itself from being a producer of computers to being a producer of all kinds of communication networks through internet, which are building what they call the intelligent planet. That is the interconnection of almost everything possible, and the software to manage all of these interconnected people and things all over the world. Then through, we can see the transport global networks. I'll show you another image soon, but this one shows how how there are three great transport through roads being organized from Mexico all the way up to Canada. It's not quite visible on this map, but you can see it perhaps in another. This is the North America Super Corridor Coalition, a private-public coalition that manages transportation from Mexico to Canada. It's a very complex network. It's connected also digitally, and the idea is to be able to ship many things by road from one part of North America to the other. I have not shown here the ports and that bring in things from the sea, like the Manzanillo port, which is connected by ships to China and so forth, also Lázaro Cárdenas, and then we have other ports going to North America. So there's a growing interconnection. We see it here in North America. But the same thing is taking place in Europe and in Asia. The global production networks, which are fundamental for the globalization of production structures, of global structures, is the idea of the world airplane, the global T-shirt, and so forth and so on. This means that to build one airplane, you need the communications, transport, and design networks, production networks all over the world. All of these countries, this is just an illustration, it's probably more complex. You need all of these countries to build one single airplane. The components are made in different parts of the world, and perhaps they're all assembled in some huge plant in the United States, but also, for instance, Mexico is also moving towards organizing maquiladoras for assembling aircraft and other similar products. This is taking place all over the world. The global value chains, which is a new concept, perhaps new from 10 to 15 years ago, that is the idea of how companies, especially the multinational corporations, have their central office in the United States, but they are connected through all of these thousands and thousands of links to other component parts of the corporation, or to corporations that are doing offshore work and so forth. It's a huge network of US corporations, German corporations, UK corporations, and more recently Chinese, of course Japanese, and now Chinese. This map is quite old, so the networks centered in China are not considered really. Then we have the geographical interconnectivity of production, in the sense that we no longer have only cities being organized around the world, but what would be called mega regions. For instance, the Los Angeles mega regions contains 21 million people, or will contain it in 2025. Central Mexico, around Mexico City, will contain 31.4 million people. And thus Washington in the United States, then we have the greater Buenos Aires with 36 million people, greater Sao Paulo, greater Rio de Janeiro. This means that cities are interconnecting with each other and forming these huge working class districts that are constructing these global production chains. You can see this in Africa taking place. You can see it, the Cairo Giza mega region. You can see this taking place in Europe, and of course Asia, India, China, exactly, with these huge mega regions. The Shanghai mega region is considered to be around 68 million people. These are all what it says here, the globalization of the world economy has raised up a working class comprised of billions and billions of people, interconnected by the process of production and working and living together in massive cities. along with these massive cities, then we have these mega corridors, where the mega cities are interconnected or are connected to smaller cities, but constitute a larger area. And you can see these on the US West Coast, the Great Lakes region, Mexico City, in the mega corridors of Mexico City that are connecting many of the states, the state of Mexico, the state of Morelos, and so forth, which are becoming one mega corridor. And the same place is taking place in China and Africa, Europe, Asia, and so forth. Of course, the driving force of this global structure of capital is capital itself. Capital is no longer merely a national phenomena connected or trading with other national capitals, but capital is becoming a global concentration of capital. Global corporations are dominating the world economy all over the planet, in Asia, from Asia to Europe to all of these other regions. There is a new discipline called physical economics, which what it does is concentrate a huge database of millions and millions of enterprises all over the world, and they have special methods to trace the interconnections between or among all these capitalist enterprises. What it means is that one global enterprise does not exist isolated, but rather is in very close relations of ownership and mutual transactions with thousands of other corporations, so that they are very closely interrelated. From what it says here is from a database of 37 million companies, 1,318 transnational corporations form the nucleus of the property and control of global capital. This means crossed shares, investments, sitting on the people. One corporation executive sits in dozens of other different corporations and so forth. So mapping all of this together, there's this list of 25 controlling corporations of the entire capital structure of the world. As you can see, they're mostly banks. This is the thesis of early 20th century Marxist studies, Lenin, and many others that studied the integration of capital, and the idea that banks are mostly those that control the industrial and commercial corporations of the world. Finance capital, the concept of finance capital, which is the fusion between strictly money capital, banks and so forth, and the industrial and commercial capitals. What it means is that these 25 corporations are in control. These mostly banks are in control of production and commercial structures all over the world. And this can be reduced, the study reduces the control of all global capital to these huge banks: Franklin Resources, Commerce Bank, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, Barclays, and so forth. These are the leading banks in the world that control 37 million companies, not directly, indirectly, but they are in control of these 37 million companies. That's the idea of this graph. Now, the economic structuring of capital and the concentration of capital and the interrelations of capital property in the whole world gives rise also to institutions of global state power. As it was said in the introduction, in the 19th century, still, although Marx had and other socialist intellectuals that studied capital had the viewpoint of capital as a global structure, no? But basically, the structure was interrelated through exchange relations, international commerce, and so forth, or investments. And this capital was organized through national states. The corporations that existed at the time were basically national corporations. Even if they had investments in other countries, still the corporation was basically national. So you had American corporations, German corporations, Japanese corporations, and so forth. And this was based on the national structure of political power. Thus, you had the United States with its borders, its own state, and so forth. The same happens with Germany and so forth. Now, what is happening today is that there are suprastate institutions being organized. They have always existed to a certain extent. Even in the 17th, 18th centuries, you had states that had alliances, that had treaties, that constructed sort of international bodies. But that was all. Basically, the power of capital was organized through the national state. And of course, the relations between national states all over the world. This is why one could say that up to the early 20th century, the global structure of state power was the sum of the national states. But this has changed fundamentally because what is occurring is that we are developing greater and greater from the League of Nations to the organizations of the United Nations system. The world capital has organized global political structures. That's why it's very important to study the United Nations systems, because of course it's not the sole source of political power as it would be in, for instance, in the United States, where you have a centralized political power that controls everything. It's true that the United Nations system does not have that same power, the same faculty, say, that the national government has within the nation itself. But what is happening is that increasingly the national power is becoming one big global power. That's the idea. It's evolving towards a global structure. Now we are in a transitional period. It's sort of we're beginning, but the tendency, this is the idea, the tendency is that global power will be more concentrated on a global basis. So we have these supranational systems we have today are the United Nations, the famous round table of the Trilateral Commission, the Council of Foreign Relations, the United Nations itself, Bilderberg Group, Club of Rome, and so forth. These interrelated global relations being consolidated in institutions that are above the nation state. Another basis for the structuring of global political power is the existence of a global military structure, of course, centered in the United States, which is struggling to maintain this situation because it is being contested from other points of the planet, that are also building their own structures. One could say to a certain extent that Western Europe has attempted to build its own structure. And of course, Asia around the BRICS institutions are trying to build something similar, not on the scale of the United States, but near approximating, and in the future, the tendency will grow, of course. It leads to the possibility, the growing possibility of very destructive wars in the future. But this is the objective process that is taking place. And not only the US bases, but also the huge alliance that the United States has built through NATO. This is the NATO command structure, which is increasing, growingly increasing in power and members, different countries. These are the more Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. This is one of the reasons of the Ukrainian war, because NATO is surrounding Russia with a view in the future to surround China with these military structures and alliances that are increasingly taking place. And then, of course, we have the Davos Economic Forum, the World Economic Forum, which is, as we have witnessed recently, it's a planning center for world capitalists. This is a place, not the only one, but it's growing in importance, where all sorts of representatives of capital unite, meet in order to discuss the world situation and to plan certain things for the future. As you can see by the graph here, of course, the United States is the dominating power, which tries to influence, but then you have the United Kingdom and so forth. Even China takes place in this forum. I'm not sure if Russia did in a moment. Of course, with the war taking place, Russia would be expelled. I haven't studied that, but it would be interesting to see if at some moment Russia also participated here. It's a very important think tank for world capitalism, which is part of the world structure of capitalism. A global capitalist class is being consolidated, ideologically, politically, economically, and of course, physically. And an interesting author was saying that contemporary wars are it's a dual war. It's a global imperialist war of conquest and a global class war, simultaneously and very much interrelated one with the other. You cannot separate class war from imperialist wars. They're not different. They're not on whether it's different levels, but they're completely interconnected. Global imperialist war is taking place in order to guarantee the subordination of the world's working classes, and so forth and so on. Most of the world's working class is facing the greatest assault on its standard of living in a century. According to Eric London of the World Socialist website, the ongoing economic crisis, the mismanagement of COVID-19, the flooding of the world with debt, and more recently, inflation, are the reasons that a mass movement of the workers of historically unprecedented proportion is spreading across the world. He mentions how the wars waged by US imperialism and allies against the peoples of the world for maintaining its world hegemony of exploitation, and the class war to make the global working class pay for the crisis and for the wars being waged are the events marking contemporary history. The oncoming recession will exacerbate the growing discontent. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell pledged that the US Central Bank would sustain higher interest rates in the name of fighting inflation, with increased unemployment and economic pain to be expected as the consequences. Already, mass layoffs, lower wage settlements, and higher prices are wreaking havoc amongst the world's workers. In order to maintain the huge profits being reaped by global financial capital, industrial, money capital, interest-paying capital, and commercial capital, through many of the measures being taken by capitalist governments, wages must be kept in place or lowered, and workers must work harder. Eric London gives an example of how profit margins in the UK are 73% higher now than in 2019 for major corporations. In the US, the Commerce Department showed profit margins at 9 financial corporations having hit a 72-year high, reaching 15.5% for the first time since 1950. Oil and gas giants have been in the forefront of this bonanza. Isabel Schnabel, an executive board member of the European Central Bank, said there was a risk inflation was raising out of control and even greater sacrifice would be needed. Central banks are likely to face a higher sacrifice ratio compared with the 1980s, even if prices were to respond more strongly to changes into
Marco, can you hear me?
Yes.
We'd like him to continue.
Yes, Betsy. I hear you, Betsy. Hello, Betsy. Hello, Betsy. What should I do? Leave and try to enter again? Okay. Okay.
Marco, I can see you and hear you, but it seems like the center's connection has gone bad.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I understand Bob. I hear Bob, and he's reading the presentation. So I suggest we continue like that. Okay. Can you hear me on screen? Oh. Okay. Should I share the screen again? Hello? Okay, I'll share it. Just a second, I think. Okay. Where should I continue? I didn't hear quite well. Where should I continue, Betsy? Hello, can you hear me? Betsy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly fine.
where should I continue?
Start right there. Unions are
Unions.
making it.
Okay, unions are making their biggest comeback since the 1960s. There's a growing process of unionizations. Nearly millions of workers have joined unions and made demands walking off the job for better conditions. New types of workers are being unionized, basically the platform workers. And you can see the Amazon organizing, Starbucks, and so forth and so on. Not also, non-unionized workers are also struggling, while wildcat strikes take place outside the conservative leadership of the trade unions. And here is a small table showing the number of work stoppages, workers, and strike days taking place. Worker struggles are globalizing. Amazon workers in 30 countries protested on Black Friday 2022. Among the countries where Amazon is facing strikes and protests, according to a source, are Argentina, Australia, etc., etc. Uber faces growing tendency for workers to unionize in several countries of the world. The deliveristas tend to organize all over the world. Public opinion is more supportive. This is a graph showing that today 68% of Americans approve unions, from a down of 48%. And of these, the Democrats, of course, are 90% of the Democrats approve unions, and only 47% of Republicans. But it's also a growing tendency amongst Republicans. The workers' economy is another aspect of the workers' struggles all over the world. Workers all over the world have developed a series of social experiments that aspire to transcend the capitalist organization of society. These experiments are largely of two types: economic and political organizations. The economic experiments that take the form of cooperatives, communes, and others focus on eliminating the alienation of labor by transforming work into a free and creative activity directed by the workers themselves, of course, within capitalist society. Two types of examples of these are the recuperated enterprises in Argentina and the Zapatista communes in Mexico. On the other hand, the workers' political experiments attempt to transcend the political domination of capital, the political state power of the capitalists, through the creation of their own instruments of political power. Examples of this type of experiments can be traced back to the sections of the sans-culottes organized by the workers during the French Revolution of the 18th century, the Paris Commune of the 19th century, to the Soviets of the 20th centuries. Certain studies show that many types of these Soviet-type organizations are emerging in different parts of the world. One, of course, is, for instance, the Zapatista movement, which is also an armed movement that holds power within their region, thanks to organized masses and the force that they have to defend themselves. A growing number of working class migrants from poor, less developed, and violent street nations are waging a world war against the rich capitalist countries. Here you can see, measured in millions, the tendencies of migrations all over the world. One of these great tendencies is from Mexico to the United States, but then we can see many other centers. The Philippines is also one of the large centers of immigration of world. And of course, it's the first world countries, the industrial countries, or some Middle East countries, which are recipients of these growing peasants, migrants from all over the world. Global workers and peasants uprisings are spreading in many parts of the so-called third world countries. You remember the Arab Spring in 2011 to the Peru uprisings on the right, which are taking place now. Development of working class consciousness. Neither the strictly economic struggle against the capitalist organization of society, the multiple experiments of self-management within capitalist society, nor the local political experiments are capable of transcending capital as long as they remain local and spontaneous reactions against exploitation and oppression. What is needed is the unified conscious struggle of the working class towards the destruction of capitalist political dominance. Today, that conscious political unity of the working class must take place on a global scale. The globalized world economy is pregnant with a socialist society that is ready to be born, but is constrained by the nation-state system and private ownership of the means of production, and held back by the capitalist parties and the nationalist trade unions. And we can add, by the dominating bourgeois liberal or petty bourgeois consciousness of many of the masses of the world. The new upsurge of worker struggles will necessarily evolve from the workers' economic class struggle against capital, better working conditions, higher standards of living, or their defense and local self-management experiments, to their struggle against the political domination of the capitalist class as a whole, through the formation of their own structure of political dominance, necessary for the transformation of bourgeois society into a worker socialist economy on a world scale. Many new forms of working class political organizations are emerging all over the world, from political groups of different ideological traditions to political study groups to global digital forums, either of working class origin or directed to the working classes. These political organizations are developing on the local, regional, and international levels. I must say that the Center for Global Justice, for instance, is one of these forums for organizing a global discussion of the workers' struggles. Many other examples can be given. Thank you very much. I end my talk here. I'm sorry it took too long and that we have these interruptions. Betsy, I ended the talk.
Thank you so much, Marco. Your presentation is somewhat overwhelming and difficult for everyone to grasp. What you show so brilliantly is that because of the international transformation of production, the resistance to the exploitation of capitalist production has to be international as well. And this is, of course, one reason why we're involved in the organization called the Workers' Economy, which is an international organization. The founder of that organization, Andrés Ruggieri from Buenos Aires, spoke on this program a few weeks ago and commented that we probably have about 10 years to solidify and concretize the international formation of an alternative to traditional capitalist production through cooperative self-management, recuperated factories, and all kinds of transition towns, all kinds of alternatives. Do you think that is a correct estimation that 10 years is about all the time we have? And the achievement, we'll ask the first question.
Betsy,
Marco?
I heard and understood the question. I'm not sure how or why Andres gives that number of years. I suppose it's based on the idea of global environmental crisis, or maybe he's thinking of a global nuclear war. I don't know which of these possibilities he's following. I see these two as the greatest dangers to the development of a global alternative to capitalism. Of course, it's very difficult for me to give how many years. I mean, you would have to be an expert in environmental questions and so forth. And of course, the possibilities of war, this can happen from one moment to the next. If one from Russia or the other from the United States press the nuclear button, it's a catastrophe for the world. When this can happen, I don't have a timetable for that. But it is a struggle against time. This is true.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Are there other questions, or do you want to put up your? Oh, okay. Those of you watching on YouTube can send a question to Cliff's email, which is
global.justice.cliff@gmail.com.
questions from the public. Let's look at the chat. Can you show us the chat, Roberto?
Well, I have a question or comment. You talked about the working class consciousness, but how about the capitalist class consciousness? William I. Robinson says that that what has formed is a transnational capitalist class. That is a class who no longer identifies with the nation states that were that gave birth to their corporations, but rather their consciousness is of based on their global interests.
Yes, it's very important, this point, Cliff. I think that the bourgeois class, the capitalist class, has globalized earlier and more and quicker than the working class. Capital has a global tendencies from its inception. It's always been a sort of a global tendency as such. So it's not surprising that the bourgeois, the capitalist class, assumes a global capital, a global nature sooner and easier to a certain extent. I mean, they have state power. They have the state power of most of the states in the world. So they have this instrument which they can use, and also they're very much connected to the global structures that we've been talking about. They reflect very much the global structures, the global needs of capital accumulation, the International Monetary Fund, and all of these structures. So it's I agree that the capitalist class has it easier to organize globally, and of course, capital has no nation. Capital is by its essence, by its nature, a global entity. The working class movement is much more complex because the working class movement is connected to the people of the different countries. It's more difficult, even though the capitalist structure is forcing workers to assume a global capital, a global structure, migrations, for instance, but also what has been mentioned on how unions can be or tend to be organized on a global level, especially the platform workers, which is easier to organize globally. It's more difficult for them. It's more difficult for the structuring of the working class, and it's more difficult for the transformation of the working class from what Marx called the class for itself. How la clase para sí, the class in itself to class for itself. It's much more difficult for the workers because, I mean, we are billions. The capitalists are millions. We are billions. So, and also the cultural differences, and so capitalists are more international in their culture. With the working classes are more differentiated. We have peasant workers. We have it's more complex for the workers, but the tendency is the same, in my opinion.
Marco, can I ask a question?
Please, Mark.
I'm currently reading.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mark is speaking.
Marco, thank you for your talk.
Can you hear him?
I can hear, but Mark was speaking just a few seconds ago. Mark was speaking.
Can I ask a question before we close?
Okay, go ahead. I think he,
Okay.
can you hear him? Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Marco, for your talk. So my questions are more of a basic nature, to be honest. Just there's the assumption from this talk that capitalism is bad and socialism is good. And firstly, I think it's a good idea with these kinds of things to first define exactly what you mean by that, because those different systems, because different people mean different things by capitalism and socialism. Nevertheless, so it's very easy to criticize, for example, the US form of capitalism because it's so extreme. But why can't there be a melding of the two? For example, in the Scandinavian countries where it's capitalistic, there's private ownership, private enterprise, and at the same time, a very robust social sector. So essentially free healthcare, I believe heavily subsidized, or there should be. You could make a system where it's a free healthcare, essentially free education up to university level, job training, heavily subsidized transportation, and so on. So it seems to me that there are benefits from both. Take the benefits from both and put them together. So the benefits from capitalism, I would say, are competition and free. Firstly, just the freedom of being able to start your own business. I think most forms of socialism involve the government giving you permission and telling you how you need to organize your business. So firstly, just on a freedom level, I'd say the capitalism form of production is preferred, but also on a competition level. There's intrinsic competition in capitalism, and I don't think that's really the case so much in socialism, though I think there are very interesting socialistic business models, like I think you touched on cooperatives. I think those could be a very, and there's a few quite successful cooperatives, like the, I can't remember the name of it, the one in Spain, where Montreal. Yes. So they're $1 billion corporation. They seem to be going for a long time, very successful. That's interesting. But so I don't see, and I didn't hear from you why capitalism is intrinsically, it does seem to be your position, that it is intrinsically, by its nature, bad and must completely go away, and socialism is intrinsically good and must completely replace capitalism. That seems overly simplistic to me. So anyway, if you could, the other thing that you mentioned that I must bring up is the imperialistic nature of capitalist wars. Yes, there have been those, but there have also been those wars of imperialism from socialistic countries as well. So, you know, Russia, the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in the 80s, for example. And so, okay, sure, those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much. Thank you very much.
Betsy, I think Mark was trying to frame a question just before this. Our comrade did so in your center. Can we give Mark the chance?
Marco, why don't you go ahead and address the questions that were just raised, and if time permits, I'll ask my question.
Okay. Bad and good. This is an ethical question. There are good guys and bad guys. This is the Hollywood theme on the class struggle or the political struggle in the U.S. Capitalism in the U.S. is basically good. It only has bad institutions or bad people. The questions which have been posed now are very complex. Each one of them would merit an entire theme to be taken. I don't think that the questions of class struggle have to do with being bad or good guys or bad guys. In what sense? I know a lot of very good capitalists. I mean, morally speaking, they love their families, they love their mothers, they give money to how do you call it, to charities. I mean, capitalists can personally be very good people. In my point of view, it's not a question, it's not an ethical question of good or bad. It's an objective question of that capital cannot survive without the exploitation of labor. It's just as simple as that. You can be the best capitalist in the world, morally speaking, but if you invest money in a corporation, in an enterprise, if you don't post a profit from the investment, it's not a question of whether you're good or bad. Or in any case, you made a bad choice and you invested in a business that has no future. But the problem is basically that capital, in order to obtain a profit, must exploit labor. You may not agree with that, but then this is a question to discuss how does capital exploit labor, which is a huge theme in itself. We can take it up if you want, but it's not an easy question. So if we agree that it's not a question of people being good or bad, but each one struggling to defend their interests, where the capitalist interests are to make more and more money on the backs of the working people. And the object of the workers is to either overthrow the whole system or at least struggle so that they don't earn, they don't have a bad living, a worse living conditions because of capital's greed, not the capitalists' greed. Capital, the act of investing to obtaining the greatest possible profit in the shortest possible time. This is the working of capital. It's a mechanism. It's an objective mechanism of how capital works. So it's, I would answer it that way. Scandinavian countries. Scandinavian countries are capitalist countries. You would have to know the history of these Scandinavian countries to understand that the gains made by workers in these Scandinavian countries are a product of workers' struggles. These are not charity or because the Swedish capitalists are more moral and more and good than others. It's not that. It's that in 1917, when the Russian Revolution took place, in the next year, 1918, there were revolutions taking place all over, especially in Europe. And one of these countries where workers organized a general strike against the capitalist the capitalist class in Sweden, made possible the organizing of government by the Social Democrats, which at the time were a representation of the workers, and they were able to organize since then for many decades a government more favorable to the workers in Sweden, not because the capitalists were charitable and good, but because the workers developed huge institutions able to resist capitalist exploitation. The Swedish working class is the most organized working class in the world. If you check the size of the trade union movement, it's one of the largest in the world. It has been, diminished because of the neoliberal tendencies in Sweden also. But nonetheless, it's one of the better organized working classes in the world. It's very difficult to establish an extreme system of exploitation in Sweden because the workers can resist it. This is not the case of many countries in the world, for instance, Mexico, where only, I think 6 or 7%, 10% max of the workers are organized in trade unions, for example, not to mention many other things. So it's not a question, it's not an ethical question, it's a question of objective conditions, economic and political conditions. As to the positive aspects of capitalism, competition and freedom, I'm afraid that this does not hold up to examination. Since the 19th century, it has been established as a law of economics that competition necessarily leads to monopoly, to monopolize. Competition means that different enterprises struggle against one another, one of the aspects of competition in any case, and it's always that the big fish eats the smaller fish. So the whole idea of the concentration and centralization of capital is built on the idea of competition. Capitalists struggle one against nations struggle. Capitalists from one country competes with others, but this necessarily leads to the big ones eating the smaller ones and capital concentrating and concentrating and concentrating. So competition is not the great benefit that one could imagine, because it necessarily leads to monopoly. The idea is not to establish either competition or monopoly. It's to overcome the whole system. And this is the same, has to do with freedom. What kind of freedom can a small capitalist have in a country that is completely dominated by monopolistic interests? It's extremely difficult to build your own. It has been demonstrated, at least in Mexico, that only 1 of 10 new enterprises survives after a year. 1 of 10. So this is the how do you say, the benefits of competition, so-called. Cooperatives and so forth. Of course, I belong to the Workers' Economy Network. I have contributed to trying to understand and to further these enterprises, these social experiments. My point of view, which perhaps not everyone in the network shares, is that whatever the case of the development of cooperatives, they take place within capitalist society. Some argue that it's the basis for destroying capital and overcoming capital relations. I think that other elements are necessary, especially some form of political power. Only through economic means, it's impossible, even if you can organize like Mondragon. My personal experience with cooperatives is that many survive and maintain their basic aim, especially if they are politically oriented cooperatives. Many of these exist in different parts of the world, many of them in Argentina, where the idea of the workers is to organize a form of work that abolishes exploitation, that abolishes the alienation of labor and so forth. This may be true within the enterprise itself. However, in order to survive, that enterprise has to compete with existing capitalist organizations. They have to compete for obtaining clients, raw materials, and then, of course, if you're in the same line of business, you have to compete with the capitalist enterprises. Some of these cooperatives can subsist within this idea of abolishing alienation of labor. Some, but many, because the cooperative movement is not a product of the 21st century. The cooperative movement is a product of the organization of capital. It's one of the forms of how workers can organize within capitalist society. So it has existed, cooperatives have existed for hundreds of years. And the problem is that many of these enterprises, sooner or later, face one of the two dilemmas. One is to go bankrupt because they cannot compete with other capitalist enterprises. And the other is that they become so successful that they transform into a capitalist organization. This has happened in Mexico. It has happened all over the world, that you have originally a workers' economy, which internally stratifies. And there is for instance, there are some enterprises in cooperatives in Mexico where the original cooperative members, since they're expanding, they have to recruit new labor. This labor is not recruited unequal circumstances with the original owners, the original cooperants. So they are contracted as workers. So you have this stratification within the cooperative, where one part of the original members become the owners, the capitalists, and the others become the workers contracted. And even to the degree that the newly contracted workers, after a time, build their own trade unions against or confronting the original owners. And this, I think, happens all over the world, and many other examples can be given. So
Marco?
I believe that the struggle is important towards these social experiments, but without global political power today, it's impossible for them to become the form of organization of society. I want them to become the forms of organization of society, but we have to we have to construct our own political power to do so. The merely economic or moral desire are not enough, unfortunately. Sorry, Betsy. Betsy, we can't hear you. You're not connected, Betsy.
Sorry about that. I let you answer at length because the question posed is often posed. And your response was, I thought, an excellent response to the questions that I forgot your name, Daniel asked. But I'd like to ask Mark Ginsburg, who has raised his hand, if he would like to ask a question now.
Well, given the time, I'll make my question brief, although the answer would be much longer. I'm currently reading Nancy Fraser's book, which many of you know, on cannibal capitalism. And I think she makes the additional point to the one Marco made, that doesn't just focus on labor relations and exploitations, but focuses on expropriation of resources and people as a fundamental part of capitalism. And that has implications also for the environment, and one could look at that. But the question I wanted to ask was related to the issue she raises about the way in which race and racism, and the way in which gender divisions and women's oppression, particularly in the areas of not production but social reproduction, take place. How would you incorporate race and gender in your well, I think very brilliant analysis?
Very complex. I believe that racial problems have to do with the reduction of part of society to a form of slavery. In antiquity, it was direct slavery or indirect slavery through the serf system. Today, the form of slavery is wage labor. But the common element of all of these forms of labor are slavery. And one aspect of slavery is that since the time of Aristotle, the slave is not considered a human being. In the case of Aristotle, he conceived the slave as the instrument of production of the slave owner. He was an instrument of production. He was not a person. He was like a cow or whatever. So there is sort of an intrinsic connection between any form of slavery and the conception by the slave-owning class that the object of his oppression, of his ownership, is not a human person, especially with these the huge movement to abolish slavery during in many times of history, but especially with the rise of capitalism, the 16th, 17th, 18th century, where so this is I think that racism, and even the women's struggle, the condition of women as a form of sort of a slave in relation to masculinity, to the male, I think is has very much in common. Women are not considered equal human beings. They are considered an instrument for reproduction, an instrument of beauty, an instrument to satisfy my sexual appetite needs. They're not considered human beings. And capitalism reproduces, since it reproduces slave relations, it reproduces this ideology of slavery. Slaves are not human beings. Women are not human beings. This would be my point of view. Betsy, can I say something to you?
I can't hear
Betsy.
him either.
Betsy, I have about 10 minutes.
Can you hear me?
I hear you. Can you hear me?
No, we
I have
can't
a-
hear you.
We hear one or another, not both at the same time.
You can't hear me.
Go
Hello.
ahead.
Okay, I just have, my question relates to the globalization of capitalism and your response that we really need to have a globalized response by the working class. My question is, how do we do that when the method of global communication is in the hands of the capitalist organizations? If we get too vocal in organizing globally, we can get just chopped off because we're limited in our forms of communication at this point only to capitalism.
Marco, would you like to?
Listen,
Would you like
Betsy,
to answer that?
if I would like to, this is my last intervention, okay? I have to leave. Betsy. Okay? Okay. Well, it's true. It's true. The means of communication are in the hands of global capitalist monopolies. However, it is possible for the state to create public means of communication. This would leave many aspects of communication in the hands of the state. But then the struggle, in the process of the struggle to abolish the state, there is a tactical, to call it some way, struggle to democratize the state. Many of the phenomena that are taking place in South America are the attempts to build more democratic states. And democratic states tend to convert into public means, formerly private means, for instance, communications, transport, and many other social forms of organization. I don't agree completely with the Mexican government today, but one of its attempts is to create a more social public environment following a very long period of privatizing everything. Everything was being privatized. And the contemporary government, in some measure, would like to return to the public what should be public means of transportation, communication, energy, networks, etc., etc. I believe that one of the struggles, one of the democratic struggles is that means not to destroy the state, but to democratize it, is that many former public things become public in the hands of the state, but in a democratic state, more in the hands of the public, which is what democracy means in a capitalist sense. So this would be my idea concerning that. I think it's something that has to be studied. Betsy, I have to go.
Thank you so much, Marco. I apologize for the technical problems, but it's
No, it's
due
all right.
to
This is-
a
this is
privatized cable firm in San Miguel. So thank you so much,
Okay.
Marco. This is so interesting and we really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
for
very
inviting
much.
me. Thank
Have
you
a
very
good
much for
day.
inviting me. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cliff, you had your hand up. So he addressed the question I was